Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today's lesson is a continuation of our last lesson. So we are going to be working with Excel again, but this time I'm going to show you 3 additional features that you can use when organizing data on an Excel spreadsheet. This data set is called Selected Labor Force Characteristics of Youth Aged 16 to 24. And basically what I'm seeing here is the total youth population across New York State. So the populations are separated by regions in New York. And we're also seeing within each region how many youth are employed and how many are unemployed. This just shows the source where I found this data set. I found it from a website called catalog.data.gov, which I highly recommend. There's a lot of information on there that can be useful to you when looking for data relating to your migrant group. This data set is different than the data set you'll be using to complete the assignment, but you'll still be able to follow the same steps. So the first step I'll need you to take is to track your changes. And the reason this is important is so that I can confirm your work is original and that your work belongs to you. To track your changes, you'll have to go up here to the Tools menu, click on Track Changes, then highlight Changes, and check this first option that says Track Changes while editing. You can leave the rest as is, so this should be checked off and this should be checked off, and then click OK. This message will pop up basically saying that it's going to save the workbook. That's fine. You can click OK. And you'll notice that now in the title, it will say shared, which means that your changes are now being tracked. So the next thing I want you to do is to type your name somewhere on the spreadsheet. And when you do that, you'll notice that the cell will be highlighted in a different color. And if you move your cursor over the cell, a description of that change will show up in a text box. And that again will show you that your changes are now being tracked. So when I open up the document, I'll be able to see all of the changes you implemented into the data set. Now, whenever I'm working with a set of data, what I like to do is I like to expand my columns if some of the information is not completely visible. So see how this information is not visible? I'm going to expand the columns so I can clearly read all of the information that's given to me. Okay, so the first feature you'll be using is the filter feature. And what's nice about this feature is it hides some of the data. It doesn't delete the data. So the data is still there. It's still in the document. It's just hidden so that you can focus your attention on the data that you might be concerned with. So to access the filter feature, you're going to have to go to Data and click this button called Filter. If this error message comes up, it's because you have to move your cell to where the columns are titled. And the reason is because when we're using the filter feature, we're using it specifically to filter information from each column. So I'll move my cell to somewhere in the column row. And when I try clicking that button again, it will work. So notice now you'll see an arrow next to each column title. Now, what I want you to filter is the year. I'm seeing data from different years. I'm going to focus my attention on the most recent year. So I'm going to click this arrow and I'm going to hit this button that says select all because that will deselect everything. And I'm only going to select the year I would like to look at. So now notice the rest of the data has disappeared and I'm only seeing data from 2018. You'll also notice that the row numbers jump. So notice this number jumped from 11 to 78. That goes back to what I explained before. The reason this is happening is because we still have data in this sheet that we're not currently seeing. So there's data between row 11 and row 78. We're just not seeing it right now because we filtered out that data. So now what I want you to do is I want you to go to the population category. And if you see 0 as an option, you're going to deselect it. In this case, I don't have 0 as an option, but in your data set, 0 will show up as an option. So you will deselect 0 so that those values no longer show up. Those values are going to be hidden. And the reason I asked you to do that is because those data values are not going to help us. In your specific data set, the reason those values came up is because for those, we were unable to find information for those specific regions. So since we were unable to find information for those regions, there was a 0 as a placeholder for those regions. The next thing I want you to do is the second feature, which is the sort feature. And you're going to sort the population category in descending order. Descending means from highest to lowest. And the reason this is nice is because I can see which regions across New York State have the highest youth population, and I can see which regions across New York State have the lowest youth population. Another thing I like to do is, if I have really big numbers, I like to turn on the comma feature because I think it's just easier to read the numbers if I have commas in place. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I think that might be helpful. And the comma feature is up here in the home section. So the next thing I would like you to do is to calculate the total sum of the population. We're going to use an Excel formula for that. And since we're using a formula, you'll have to start by typing in an equal sign. Then you're going to write sum, open parentheses, and you're going to write your starting cell and your ending cell. So my starting cell is C2. My ending cell is C11. C2 colon C11 close parentheses. And I'm just going to name this row so it's obvious to the reader that this represents the sum of the youth population. And now I'm basically seeing the total youth population across all of New York State. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate percentages. So I'm going to create a new column, and I'm going to call it the percent of employed youth out of the total youth population. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking the population of employed youth. So we're going to be using information from this column. This column represents the youth labor force across each region. We're going to be taking these values and we're going to be calculating them into percent form. So in order to do that, we're going to have to compare these values to the total youth population. Because remember, when calculating percentages, a percent is a part out of a whole. This is the whole. This is the total youth population, and these will be the parts. The amount of youth employed in every single region across New York State. And this information just might be helpful to me so that I can see the youth labor force for different regions, but in percent form. So you might remember from the last lesson that if we want to calculate a percentage, first you'll have to put an equal sign. You'll have to write down the cell that represents the part and write down the cell that represents the whole. So for this first region, my cell is D2 / representing out of or divide by, and then the whole which is the sum of the total population. That cell is C79. So the percentage is now calculated, and what I want you to do is format it into percent form using this button. And I also want you to express it to the nearest hundredth, meaning 2 digits after the decimal. So you're gonna have to use this button so that you can increase the decimal by 2 digits. Now, when we were doing this before, we were able to just copy and paste the formula for the rest of the regions. That's not the case here. The reason that's not the case is because our bottom value is the same for each of these percent calculations. So if I try to copy this and then paste it for the next region, an error message will pop up. The reason this error message is popping up is because look at the formula that was copied. The top cell is correct. The top cell should be D3 because D3 represents the youth population for the next region. But the bottom cell is incorrect. The bottom cell was changed to C80. C80 is empty. I want the bottom cell to stay as D79. So in order to do that, I'm gonna have to go back and place an anchor on the bottom cell. That anchor will basically keep that bottom cell in place. In order to place an anchor, I'll have to put a $sign in front of the letter and a $sign in front of the number. Now, when I try copy and pasting it, I have an accurate percent calculation. And notice my formula is also accurate because I have D3 as the top cell and C79 remains as the bottom cell. So then you can paste that into the remaining regions, and all of these calculations will also be accurate. So if I check the formula for this last region, the formula is correct because I have D11, which is the total youth population that's employed in that last region, out of C79, which was the sum of the youth population across all of New York State. And that's basically it. Those are all the features that I wanted you to practice for today's lesson. So I wanted you to practice the filter feature, the sort feature, how to use the sum formula, and how to use an anchor when using percent formulas. So once you have all of that, you can just save your document and upload it into the assignment on Blackboard.